Good afternoon, everyone. Today, the Charlotte City Council is hosting a special meeting inside the Government Center. We are conducting this meeting in compliance with all applicable laws. We do have virtual participation by several council members, and all of this has been done, as I said, consistent with the emergency orders to allow all of this. Today's focus of the agenda is the Unified Development Ordinance that is this meeting is a precursor to the staff bringing back a final draft recommendation to the council. The purpose of today's meeting is to iron out any of the issues that any council member would have, and appreciate that the City Council has shared that information with the planning director and staff as we are going through this, so that there's an opportunity for the staff to take the feedback that they've heard from both the council as well as community and make recommendations on the major issues that we find that require council's recommendation and comment. So today, at the end of today's meeting, we will discuss up to 4 items, maybe 3 if we if we can't get to the 4th, which I understand can be dealt with in a different way. But I think that what we're doing is that the planning director and an entire cast of staff will be here in the room to assist. Our goal is, again, for the staff to bring forward those areas of issue that we would like to make sure that we have resolution of, I like to say it, of a majority of council to direct that this is what should be included in the final recommendation from the staff. So with that understanding, are there any questions about the agenda for today? Okay, seeing no questions, I'm going to turn it over to Allison Craig, our planning director, to begin the discussion of those topics that have been identified for a decision going forward. Allison?
Thank you, Mayor, and I appreciate the time that council members are taking for a special session to talk through UDO items. What we'd like to do today as the mayor mentioned, is bring several topics from the draft UDO where we've received a significant number of comments through the community, both through our online comment portal as well as in community conversations. These are topics that have come before you all, both in council committee as well as in full council, where we've briefed you on these topics and some of the summary of the comments that we received from the community. And what we'd like to do today is provide some recommendations to you all for consideration for changes on these topics that will then shape the next draft of the UDO, which we expect out in late May. And so we will start first with the topic of heritage trees. Actually, if you can go to the next slide. Yep, thank you. So we're going to start first with heritage trees. And Tim Porter, our Chief Urban Forester, will talk through some of the recommendations that we're proposing that go into this next draft. So I will turn it over to Tim.
Thank you, Allison. Good afternoon, Mayor Lyles, Mayor Pro Tem, council members. Heritage trees has been the most high-profile and focused tree regulation proposed in the UDO. That's why we're talking to you today. Next slide, please. The reason the heritage tree regulation has been proposed really stems from recent canopy work over the last couple of years. A 2019 tree canopy analysis revealed that tree canopy is declining significantly in the city of Charlotte. 8%, from 2012 to 2018, it declined very rapidly in residential areas. Overall, it was approximately 6%. The biggest decline was in incremental single individual lots. Heritage trees are a very common type of regulatory tool that many cities statewide and nationally use to meet their tree canopy goals. We do have a heritage tree regulation in our current tree ordinance, but it's a very, very relaxed and kind of low-level preservation tool. So we're proposing an increased preservation approach in the first draft. And that approach would be to protect all native trees in Charlotte, native to North Carolina, that are 30 inches or greater in DBH. Mitigation for the removal of those trees is required unless those trees are dead, diseased, or dying and hazardous. They can be removed without a permit if they fall into those categories. And the requirements proposed would apply equally to both land development scenarios and non-land development scenarios. So properties that are not going through a development permitting process, on those properties, regardless of the development status, heritage trees would be protected, which is a big step forward. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in the first draft, the regulations would apply evenly to those two scenarios, land development and non-land development. The heritage tree definition is 30-inch DBH, which is a diameter of a tree trunk at about 4.5 feet height off the ground. And the tree has to be native to North Carolina. In the second draft, and before I go into the specific changes for this area right here, I wanted to mention that we have heard a lot of feedback from numerous stakeholders and interest areas during the UDO public engagement process. There's been hundreds of comments submitted regarding tree canopy initiatives. We've heard from the general public, the development industry, of course, council, our consultants for the UDO comprehensive plan and the tree canopy action plan. And we've really conducted an internal detailed assessment of many factors that go into determining what to propose in these regulations. So in the second draft, upon assessing all that and hearing from all those interest areas and stakeholder groups, we're really trying to find the right balance of preservation, mitigation, and tracking. Those are the key intent areas. So in the second draft, on the right hand of that slide, we're proposing to pivot and separate the requirements and have them apply differently for land development scenarios and for non-land development scenarios. Again, those are general property owner type situations. The definition of a heritage tree of 30 inches in diameter, native North Carolina tree species, would remain the same. Next slide, please.
Can I just ask what What, is breast level consistent in one spot, or is it, does it depend on the
It's a
tree?
great question. So yeah, it's defined as 4.5 feet above the grade, the lowest grade adjacent to that tree. So it's always 4.5 feet. It's a traditional forestry term that's just carried forward into urban forestry. And so DBH means 4.5 feet above the ground. You take a measurement around the trunk of the tree. Sure. And what we would likely do as we roll out a heritage tree regulation, if it's adopted, is to really clearly maybe convert that to a circumference. Sometimes that's easier for lay people to understand. So a lot of text on this slide, so I'll take a little bit of time to go through it. On the left, for all these slides, is the first draft of where we are. The primary intent is preservation. A very strong preservation intent is what was included in the first draft. The strategy attached to that preservation approach is that heritage trees must be required in the majority of cases, unless a very severe, significant conflict is demonstrated. That would apply both to development scenarios and the non-development scenarios. Secondary intent areas were mitigation, to ensure that tree canopy is sustainable and continues to thrive and be replenished. There is mitigation requirements for any authorized removal. We also want to track heritage trees to learn more about what component of the tree canopy do they really make up. Population-wise, canopy cover-wise, how significant are they? So after assessing all the input we've received and conducting some internal analysis, we looked a lot at property rights, the awareness of property owners for these new regulations, tree canopy preservation, how would this be applied administratively, and looking to find this better balance between preservation, mitigation, and tracking for heritage trees, we're moving towards this separated application of regulation. So for land development, pivoting to find a better balance of those three intent areas, elevating mitigation and tracking to a primary intent, and really moving towards an incentivized preservation approach. In talking to our consultants, we received feedback that the first draft, the way heritage tree preservation was proposed, would really significantly limit development opportunities, in some cases preventing it completely. So we felt that carried a lot of weight. I'm sorry, could you go back real quick? So on the bottom right, as we separate and move into the non-land development area of heritage tree regulations, we're proposing to keep this dual approach, but the preservation, mitigation requirements would apply differently. The intent is to emphasize mitigation and tracking. We feel we need to learn a little bit more about the makeup of heritage trees in neighborhoods in Charlotte. We know there's a significant decline incrementally on residential individual lots. We have a little bit of data. Doug Shoemaker with UNCC has provided a study of one neighborhood, Revolution Park, that found that 60% of the canopy in that neighborhood is made up of heritage trees, while heritage trees account for a much smaller overall population, which is very valuable and important, but we're not certain how that applies on a citywide scale, but also a neighborhood scale. So increased awareness and understanding of how heritage trees really influence development, but more importantly, apply to and influence and apply in our overall tree canopy was one of the main factors in deciding to move in this direction and recommend a more balanced intent approach, elevating mitigation and tracking. It's a big step in the non-land development areas where we would not require preservation of heritage trees. They could be removed. And we'll talk more about what the process is at for property owners. And focused on a preservation intent that's more geared towards awareness in those situations. So I want to stop and see if there's any questions.
Mayor Pro Tem?
So
I guess I'm confused by that, Tim, and what the overall impact is. Land development meaning when there is the proposal for construction of a new structure or the addition or expansion of a structure. Non-land development being people just want to take down the trees?
So non-land development would be, it could be any type of property that's just not developing, or it's not triggering the level of development that the city regulates. Development applicability triggers for tree regulations would be the construction of a new principal structure, addition of additional built-upon area or building coverage. And we're proposing to step into infill development as well and start regulating that. So individual lots, we don't regulate right now, kind of residential infill, demo, rebuild, we don't regulate that right now. That's the line we're trying to draw, is between development that the city regulates or proposes to regulate and scenarios where it's just general property owner decision-making on their land.
And so you're saying that, so if it's just the resident decides, I want to take down that tree because it's too shady or whatever, they should be able to do that, is what you're saying?
Yes, it's a big step in a new direction. And hearing a lot of concerns about property rights and how this may be a step too far, the first proposed heritage tree preservation requirement in the first draft, we're recommending we pivot for those non-development scenarios, require mitigation and permitting, but there'd be flexibility to remove those trees.
It just seems to me that if you're saying, if you're talking about non-land development because of concerns that property owners have rights, doesn't that apply to land development? I mean, isn't that then going to be what everybody says, is I have rights on my property and therefore I should be able to do whatever I want? I mean, it just feels like a little bit of a slippery slope that, you know, we could end up with some state backlash saying you can't control any trees at all. They're not yours unless they're on right-of-way city property.
That was a primary concern of ours in talking with our attorney's office and just really trying to get a good understanding of how a very strong step in this way could initiate a response.
End up that way. So even, I mean, to me, that's what is the frustrating part of this, because the majority of our trees that we've lost have been on private property, residential property. And it's almost like, then why are we, I don't know, why are we trying to do this if we're going to have a backlash that says you can't tell property owners what to do? Because if most of it is on non-land development, then why are we doing this?
So, I mean, right now, we don't regulate that at all. And so even with the proposed revisions, we would still require a permit and require mitigation. So it's more than what we're doing today. And it also helps us get into a position where we actually have an understanding of what canopy loss is really occurring, because we're requiring a permit now for that and being able to track it, but allowing them to be able to remove them.
Okay, so you would still be requiring a permit to remove it, even on non-land development? Okay.
Correct.
All right,
Yep.
that's better at least.
And we'll touch on required mitigation. That's part of that as well in a slide or two here.
Yeah.
I do want to add, we conducted a peer city analysis as part of the Tree Canopy Action Plan that included Raleigh and 3 other cities outside of North Carolina: Austin, Atlanta, Washington, D.C. But we also, that was conducted by our consultant. But recently, we conducted an in-state analysis that looked at other municipalities and towns and cities that play by the same rules that we do statewide. And what we found is that we're not aware of any town or municipality that has a blanket coverage like we proposed in the first draft, where at all times a defined heritage tree could not be removed, could not be trimmed without a permit. We felt that, like I said earlier, we're kind of at a one now on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the strongest preservation approach with our current heritage tree regulation. We felt the first draft was a step to an 8 or a 9. And there was concern that we would get so far out in front of the pack that we may trigger some response from.
Trigger something.
So it is a step to a
Okay,
more
let's-
relaxed approach.
Let me get to Mr. Phipps. Mr. Phipps?
Yeah, I had a question about land development. Are we saying if we have a rezoned parcel of 5 acres that's vacant, but it has a substantial tree canopy, are we saying that lot would have to be surveyed to determine the existence of any heritage trees and that they would have to be preserved?
So in the rezoning process, we would not require that survey requirement, Councilmember Phipps.
Okay, so this doesn't apply to land development where you have a rezoning where you want to build something?
Yes, land development, not in the rezoning process, but in the permitting process, there would be survey requirements for heritage trees. We're proposing that those heritage trees may be removed, and if a demonstrated conflict is shown by the development customer.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Driggs?
Thank you, Mayor. So I'm listening to this and I'm trying to understand how the issuance of a permit would work. So what are the conditions for being issued? I mean, this is not an outright prohibition, right? It says you have to get a permit. But what would be the conditions? You've mentioned, Tim, like a conflict. But what tests are actually applied when we decide whether or not to issue a permit?
Can we jump ahead to the next slide, please? I think we might cover it in just a second. So in land development scenarios, Councilmember Driggs, the developer, their design team would have to submit a site plan showing some type of reasonable conflict. You know, it could be road infrastructure, utility service, stormwater management pond. If it was a 7-acre property that a developer wanted to, construct 5 multifamily buildings, that 5th building, if it's in a place where there's some heritage trees, we may ask, is there any way to articulate this differently? If there's not, okay, you may remove those heritage trees. The permitting for development scenarios would be handled during existing land development permitting through the Charlotte Development Center. The non-land development scenarios, general property owners, we would develop a new permitting process with an urban forestry team in the planning department, and property owners would submit a basic application. There'd be a basic application fee. We would assess the application, and you tell them the mitigation requirements, which is a small fee of $500 and replanting of at least 1 tree. That fee, the mitigation fee, could be eliminated if they plant additional trees.
Okay, I mean, in my mind, a lot depends on the detail of what goes into the permit issuance process. But I think you've answered this. This is not just in the context of a rezoning, right? So no tree can be touched by anybody at any time other than in accordance with these policies, right? So if you have by right rezoning, for example, these rules would, notwithstanding any existing zoning classification, would restrict the elimination of trees.
Just heritage trees, yeah, just heritage trees, right.
Correct, yeah, the heritage trees. And the, when you say the survey, would they look to see whether or not the tree is going to be damaged by what is proposed? If you're going to put a building up and excavate for a foundation for a building within the radius of the roots of the tree, and there's a danger that you would actually kill the tree, is that going to be part of the permit issuance or the process, I guess, for deciding about allowing buildings to be built?
That's correct, yeah. During land development permitting, a site plan would come in with a survey showing any required heritage trees that have to be shown compared to where their grading, where their roads, parking, their future buildings would be. If there are heritage trees that are located outside of those disturbed areas, we would seek to require the preservation of those trees. But if there are heritage trees located within the buildable area of a site, they could be removed by a development customer if they show there's going to be a conflict. If, for example, if there's a heritage tree located in a corner of a proposed, 80-foot by 80-foot lawn space area, I think we would seek to preserve that tree. But if that same tree was located within 10 feet of a future building foundation, we would allow removal but require mitigation.
And last question, I don't know if you're going to talk about this, but are we projecting, based on the rules that are being proposed here, how many trees would be preserved that would otherwise be destroyed, or what we think in other words, are we analyzing how this will actually affect the path of development over a 5 to 10 year horizon?
One of the motivating factors in our pivot from the proposed first draft regulations to a more balanced, relaxed preservation approach is to track it better over the next few years to understand that type of trend better, Mr. Driggs. What we're thinking is that next calendar year, when we take on an update to the tree canopy goal and the urban forest master plan, is to have a targeted analysis of this issue and then come back after the completion of the new canopy goal project to possibly propose additional amendments to the heritage tree regulation. Once we have a better understanding of how impactful they are to development, but also how important are they to the canopy.
Okay, thank you. We just need to reconcile these requirements with our goal of bringing the cost of housing down, because they work at cross purposes. But that's my last question. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
Ms. Ajmira?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. Could we go back to the slide where it's preservation and strategy slide, the one before this? No, not this one, the one where you got land development and non-land development. Yes, so I just wanted to follow up on Mayor Pro Tem's question here. So let's say if someone wants to build ADU, would that be considered non-land development, or would that be considered land development? I see there is 1,000 square feet to an existing structure. So if it's less than that, would that be considered non-land development?
I think it would likely trigger land development requirements. The square footage would be 1,000 square feet of cumulative building coverage or built upon area, or 5% of the existing site. So I think in that scenario, almost in every case, an accessory dwelling unit would definitely trigger land development requirements.
Got it. So I don't quite follow this, where we got the preservation requirement in land development, but not in non-land development. How did you all arrive at that?
It was based on assessing all of the public comments. Some of the comments were very focused on property rights, and that strong step from having no blanket general property protection on trees into this world of a very strong preservation blanket requirement. At present, we don't have any tree preservation requirements that aren't triggered by development, except for city trees. Just by sheer existence in the public right-of-way, they're protected. This is a really big step into that world. So the property rights concerns, along with learning that, to our knowledge, no other city or town in North Carolina has a protection like this that strong. We felt it made sense to study the issue more over the next 1.5 to 2 years and pivot to a more incentive-driven mitigation approach and track this better.
Tim, we have the data from UNC Charlotte on majority of the canopy loss had occurred on residential lots. A lot of them was for the infill development. Mm-hmm. Would that, do we know from the data that's being provided by UNC Charlotte and Doug Shoemaker, is that would that fall under land development, or we don't have any data to tell us that it would probably be all non-land development?
I don't think we have the data that says it's one or the other. I think, based on my assessment and look at that data, I think it's largely infill development that we don't regulate now, but I can't say unequivocally which one it is.
Yeah, so do we know with this strategy, and looking at the number of permits and development requests that comes, what are we trying to get to in terms of our tree canopy goal, right? Especially with our land development preservation strategy and not having any preservation required under non-land development, what would our tree canopy look like?
This regulation, and there's a new regulation to require street tree planting for infill development. Both these regulations were targeted efforts to achieve Council's recently adopted and comprehensive plan goal of reducing the decline of tree canopy in neighborhoods in infill development scenarios. So we believe those two tools will achieve that, but we also think there may be an opportunity to be more intentional and strategic, and tracking this over the next 18 months to 2 years may provide us a better foundation to be more comfortable with a step in the property rights area to have a stronger preservation. I think we want to learn more about how these regulations will help kind of stay the decline and possibly replenish canopy in those areas. With these regulations, we're proposing a mitigation fee for development scenarios of $1,500 per tree and the planting of one mitigation tree. Development customers would have to pay that fee and plant the mitigation tree. They could reduce that fee $250 per additional mitigation trees planted. So if you plant additional mitigation trees, you could essentially wipe out that mitigation fee. Those mitigation fees will go to support the Canopy Care program, which will help manage and support low-income residents who have to manage tree canopy on their properties, but also go right back into tree planting on those private properties, possibly in partnership with Trees Charlotte. In the non-development world, we're proposing to reduce that fee to $500 with the planting of one mitigation tree. That mitigation fee could also be reduced down to zero if additional mitigation trees were planted. Each mitigation tree gets a $250 credit. In some cases, mitigation trees may not be able to, there's not enough room on certain sites, so they might not be able to be planted. So the fee may be required at some level. And again, those fees would be used towards the maintenance, care, and replanting of trees on private property in residential areas.
So what I hear you say, there will be some sort of fees required even in non-land development. Even though we may not have the preservation requirement, there is still that mitigation fee requirement. Is that correct?
That is correct. We're still proposing to regulate those trees, admittedly in a very relaxed preservation approach, but require mitigation and require a permit to do that.
So in feedback, Tim, that you received from homeowners, did any of them share an example of in non-land development why they were against the preservation, especially if there was no conflict?
We did receive, we received a fair amount of feedback from just general property right advocates who just don't want to be told how to manage their land, and they felt that this proposed regulation in the first draft was a step too far. So we did take that into consideration when developing the recommended changes for the second draft.
Thank you.
Mr. Newton?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Tim, for the presentation thus far. So I would assume that generally speaking, developers would fall within the land development customer category.
Yes.
That we currently have a policy, as I understand it. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off if you were responding to that.
Yes, you're correct. You're correct.
Okay. Okay, so it's my understanding we currently have a policy for developers, when they develop a parcel, they are required to preserve a certain percentage of tree canopy on that parcel. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
So that being the case, how would these heritage trees, would that fall within that percentage, or would the heritage tree, this provision allowing developers to cut down heritage trees, would this fall outside of that and in effect add to that percentage of, cut into that possible percentage of preservation on a given parcel?
I think either situation could play out. A developer could preserve heritage trees within their tree save area, which is the preservation requirement. Right now, we offer extra credit for large trees in those areas that are preserved. So they may get credit for those heritage trees within their tree save area, but also they may be preserved outside of those areas. They may be required to be preserved outside of those areas if there's no conflict. For example, like my lawn space example from earlier, it may be an individual tree that's not threatened by any type of land disturbing activity. We would require that tree to be preserved. If it was closer to a building foundation or a road or something like that, they'd be allowed to remove it. Development customers, we're proposing, would get double the credit for tree save when preserving a heritage tree. One step into a new area is the infill development regulations, a single lot residential. We don't regulate that right now. We're proposing that heritage trees on those lots would have to be regulated now through the development process. We're also requiring perimeter trees or street trees to be planted on those properties. The last couple years, Mecklenburg County does regulate that type of development. They've seen about 15,000 permits per year, the majority of which we don't regulate at all. So we think there's a significant new opportunity here to plant thousands of additional trees, require the planting, I should say, and the preservation of some heritage trees on those sites as well.
So essentially, this could lead to a result whereby developers would be allowed to preserve fewer trees than today simply by asking for permits for heritage trees. Is what I think I'm hearing. Is that correct?
No, I would argue that the preservation requirements are stricter. Heritage trees, while we are proposing to relax that preservation requirement from the first draft, it's still a new requirement. We're proposing to increase the tree safe requirement to make it 15% for all development sites. I think the preservation requirements are increasing. On private property, not going through to development permitting, property owners today don't have to preserve their heritage trees. We're saying now you have to mitigate for the removal of those trees and pay a fee. I think developers would end up likely preserving more trees overall. In some areas, there will be more flexibility, though.
That's so helpful. So what you're saying is that the tree save requirement will be expanded under the UDO, which
Yes.
in effect will lead to more preservation per parcel or per lot.
In many cases, yeah, absolutely. We're proposing to remove all exemptions. There are a significant amount of acreage and properties in Charlotte that are exempt from tree save currently. We're proposing to remove all exemptions, meaning all sites, including Uptown, would have to meet their tree save requirements. Some sites will have the ability to do a green roof, off-site tree save, or payment in lieu. Payment in lieu is a very popular option, and that supports our canopy preservation program. We've acquired hundreds of acres across the city. We've preserved more land than developers would have if they didn't pay out of that. The fee for that option, there's a cap that development customers use as a multiplier. That fee is based on early 2000 county revaluation appraised tax values. We're proposing to update that fee to current appraised values. That fee would increase to $192,000 per acre versus the $80,000 per acre it is right now. So that's a significant increase. Development customers would, pay more if they choose that option, and that would allow the city to theoretically acquire more land to offset that canopy loss that wasn't provided.
If a developer or anyone for that matter were to cut down a heritage tree and then be required to plant a new tree, would that new tree be required to be a heritage tree?
We would require that tree to be protected. It would now be a code-required tree that it'd be protected in perpetuity until that site develops again and triggers new requirements. So it would not be a situation, this is what we're recommending anyway. We're recommending that any mitigation tree planted by a developer for a heritage tree removal would thus become protected in and of itself, and it'd have to be preserved on site, and the removal of it would need a permit from the city. So I think that mitigation approach would require, it would require more tree planting overall. Yes, heritage trees may be removed, but more trees will get planted back to offset the loss than we currently require today.
So
I don't think that would be a true one-to-one comparison, though, right? Because we're talking about a heritage tree, which is a mature tree with with significant tree canopy in its own right, and then the new trees being planted. How long would that take, Tim, for a new tree to reach that mature tree state where it would actually be a true mitigator, where it would provide the same level of tree canopy that the original heritage tree provides?
So that's a great question, good point, is that, the value, the trade-off of a heritage tree, the benefits it provides, certainly is not equal on day one of replanting. So those trees would take likely a few decades to get back to an even, level of benefits being produced to offset the loss of the heritage tree.
Yeah, I think it bears noting here that that when we overlay our comp plan upon this and we look at where that missing middle development will likely occur, and I guess this gets to Councilmember Driggs's question regarding impact and where that impact is going to be felt, which it sounds like you'll be tracking. But I do wonder about areas that might be exempt due to deed restrictions and covenants within those neighborhoods, and us seeing a significant loss of tree canopy in maybe more vulnerable areas that we won't see replenished for decades. That's my concern in this, and I would like to see a more one-to-one comparison personally.
Okay, thank you.
thank you, Mr. Newton. Tim, I just want to, from what I've heard so far, let me just try to see if I'm correct. The council has established a goal to stop or to improve the tree canopy loss. We've done some work in specific neighborhoods, but we're looking at something that we would like to do that would actually work with the goal of looking and of staying closer to what's possible in our state, considering what we have to do. I guess what I'm struggling with is that while we have the deck here, I can't tell what's current and what's new, and I can't tell, there are no fee numbers there. We're talking on the philosophy of big picture now, and if this is going to be in the UDO, it has to have more like level setting and definitive comments around it or information about it. So when we say that I guess what I'm going to ask for is that if you had the existing ordinance and you had what you were proposing categorized in a way that would be a comparable, that would be helpful for us to see what would change. And you'd have to include how we would do enforcement as opposed to what we're doing now. So it's kind of, it's a wide open discussion, it seems to me right now, that isn't getting us down to what we would actually be recommending and doing. The second thing I think is that you've said that there's a short term and a long term. that you need more information to do some of the things that you think long-term would result in helping our neighborhoods. But at the same time, in the short term, you've got to collect the data. And I think I can't remember who asked the question, do we have the data to project what any impact of an ordinance would be in a way that we'd be able to kind of define that expectation of what we're doing? And I don't feel like we've got enough detail to have this discussion in a way, except in a big way that we want to, first, we have a policy to mitigate the loss of trees in our city. Second, we want to be consistent with what other communities in our state are doing, so that we have that possibility of stretching where Charlotte may be, but not necessarily stretching too far. And then there's a process question of how would this look? How would it work? You know, who's going to go out and do this and what fees? I think that for me, I'm having a difficult time framing this as an action step, and I need some help to do that. So I just need some help to see what it was, what it is, and if there is data across the Southeast, I'm assuming trees and heritage trees are like, you know, those zones of planting and all of that you see in Southern Living magazine. But I'm assuming that, what would be the difference and what would be the impact as we take this? And it would be helpful to do that. Now, I know Mr. Bakari also wants to say, have remarks or questions. I think that I'm feeling lost on this one. It's just, I'm just feeling lost, okay?
So
All right.
maybe what we could do for this one is come back maybe to committee to tap and talk through maybe this comparable and begin there, and then come back to full council with that.
I think that's a good idea. I think that you've got to get something that shows why you're saying, I mean, I all understand the general tree canopy, but why this method and what results would be expected and how does that help us achieve it? What does it specifically change? I think would be the categories that, and I know that you've heard from other council members as well, saying things like, what does this mean for development? And even like, I read the bullet and it said something like what development could be 1,000 square foot house, but that doesn't come across as we're talking about this. We got to get something that we can really feel and understand. And I would like to ask the Mayor Pro Tem if this could come back and have further discussion. And so with that, I'm going to, we have two other items that are just as difficult. I'm going to recognize Mr. Bakari, and then we'll move on to the next topic.
Thank you. On the premise of what we've heard of the direct impacts, fees, the cost of replanting and adding additional trees, as well as the indirect time that it takes to go through the new process that expands and extends things, have you guys done a formal quantitative impact analysis that lets us know what the incremental change to housing affordability that this creates?
Do you want me to take that, Tim? So in terms of housing affordability and development, I think what Tim is proposing in this provides some flexibility, so those projects can be developed but still have a strong preservation intent. And so I think it's actually helping affordability by having some level of flexibility, because our consultants have found that the way the heritage tree regulation is written today creates some serious challenges for bringing those types of products to our market. And so what we're doing here, I think, helps relieve the pressure of that.
Yeah, I have no doubt that current ordinances and processes are not optimal. But I think if we care about affordable housing the way that we claim we do, we need to be serious about the data and the approach we take to how are we impacting it. Because I can tell you with absolute certainty, when we say that this process is going to have to be permitted in this way and then reviewed, that means time is added to a process, which means it costs more. When we say that $12, $15, $2,000 fines or fees are levied, that costs more, and all those costs are ultimately passed on into the end product. So, and that's directly impacting affordable housing. If it's a little better than it was before, I applaud that. I think it's great. I think we need to quantify that, and we need to know, can we make it even better? Because if we go back to what the 2040 plan and the UDO is all about, that, you know, being able to anticipate or predict, you know, what things are going to cost and what processes are going to be, their timeframes, is one of a critical part that directly correlates to affordable housing. So I hope we can take that as a follow-up so we understand what kind of overhead we're adding to this ultimate process.
If I could just add a response to that, as part of our economic impact analysis, there is an affordable housing specific focus group. And what we are looking at is a suite of different ways in which we can remove barriers for bringing affordable housing to our community that we're working on as part of that, and we'll bring to you at a later date, but it'll cut across different parts of the UDO to be able to help on the cost front as well as the speed front.
Yeah, and I applaud that, as you know. So I think, though, that just a final piece of guidance is, if you have the ability to take what is obviously very complicated and has quantitative and qualitative factors that go into it, and bring it back to us, even though there's assumptions that we'll note, in a simple measurement, that's going to be most easy. And an example of that is, you know, based on what we've heard many times, but we can challenge that. There's a 30% overhead that's placed in our processes that adds 30% of additional costs to things that are being rezoned and going through these permitting processes. So understanding a baseline, and then if what we're doing is bringing that down to 28% or up to 32%, it will at least be directionally correct and simple enough for us to understand what our decisions are doing and how they're impacting.
Thank you. We are now going to move to the second topic.
I have my hand up, Madam Mayor.
I'm sorry, what now?
This is Mr. Winston. I have my hand up.
I know, I saw it, but then it went down, so
Thought he put his
sorry
hand down.
if we missed it. Where are you, Mr. Winston? I can't see you.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I wasn't being nosy now. I wasn't really asking, where are you? I was just saying, can I see your picture on the screen? Let me be real careful here. I'm so sorry I said it that way. Are you virtual with us?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
Okay.
So there are a couple things. I completely agree with the mayor's assessment. We need to present this a little differently. I want to remind us that our tree canopy is not something nice to have. It's a must to have. And, you know, it is not easily just straight one-to-one quantifiable, simply quantifiable to, you know, tie the mitigation of canopy loss to affordability, because development in this city would not occur immediately or over time if it were not for our tree canopy. It is one of the reasons why the city has developed and grown in the way that it has, and it continues to invite people here to exist upon it, and what differentiates us. So if we, you know, a huge part of, well, the main part of this land use exercise is to employ growth strategies that continue for us to grow. So if we don't figure out this heritage tree portion, we lose one of the aspects that will continue to, you know, make us grow. It's quite different than just one-to-one costs. We'll also say that there is a strong level of environmental justice here, which we need to overlay. Affordable housing is not affordable. In fact, it is quite expensive if it is not built amongst heritage trees. If you have an environment that does not provide the benefits of our city in every zip code of this city, because you are just looking at balance sheets, then we are not meeting our goals. So I will push back on Mr. Bakari's point. I hope we don't just adopt that strategy of having a simplistic kind of fiscal analysis to determine whether or not we move forward, because we have to layer that environmental justice quotient over top of this. So with that said, I would like to address this a bit from a land use perspective, specifically a zoning perspective. One, I would also say, before we make a decision, I think it's important that we get the county's feedback on here, because heritage trees are not just about the tree canopy. They are about stormwater mitigation. To Mr. Newton's point earlier, one of those things that you can't account for when you're replanting is that stormwater, that loss of permeable land. Heritage trees drink a lot of that water that would run off into our streams and our system. So I would like to get the county's perspective and feedback and position on this, because it affects this. So from a land use perspective, forgive me if I'm mistaken, but haven't we been presented time and time again that says the largest canopy loss doesn't come from large developments, but comes from single-family zone properties, existing single-family zone properties? Is that correct?
That's correct, as an aggregate, yes.
Okay, so if we're trying to mitigate the loss, shouldn't we aim for the highest marginal place to slow that loss down?
Yes.
We actually want to get to those goals.
I would agree, yeah. We should target those areas to preserve and replenish the canopy as best we can.
I think that what we have to, as a council, make that a policy decision, and that's a good point, again, to say, well, how does this, do we have data around it? Do we know what would happen? So, Mr. Winston, we'll do we'll ask the staff to give us as much information on that.
I got a couple other questions, but.
No, I wasn't cutting you off. I was just commenting that we'd like the staff to give as much data as you would add in your last question. So thank you.
But that's kind of my question. Since we already know where the canopy loss is and what the source of it is, what data are we looking for, and what direction would we expect further regulation? What direction would we be going down in 2 years that we wouldn't be going down today?
Tim, if I could jump into that. So I think we understand where the canopy loss has occurred in single-family areas or in that type of place in our community, but it's hard to understand whether or not that's occurring because of a homeowner decision to remove a tree or if it's due to a development type of activity. So we don't fully understand that. And I think we've heard some concerns from residents that are concerned about the cost of not being able to remove a tree from their property for whatever reason there is that they would like to do that. And so therefore, the approach proposed is that in these areas, we allow the tree removal to occur, but we require a permit so that we can understand exactly why the tree is being removed, if it's a function of a decision that's made or if it's because of a development activity, and then still requiring mitigation in those areas so that we are adding back tree canopy even if a tree is removed.
Okay, so on existing single-family zone properties and future single-family zone properties, this current proposal, this revision to the proposal, is stating that that landowner can cut down that tree no matter what. However, they have to get a permit, and if they haven't presented some type of mitigation, they can still cut it down, but they would have to pay a fee. Is that what we're saying?
That's correct. And this is an area where we do not we have no regulations in this space today. Correct, Tim?
All right.
Yes, that's correct.
So, you know, I believe we're going to get sued no matter what, any way we go. So I believe that we should try to go as robust as possible and specifically on the non-land development piece. I'm kind of comfortable with where the land development piece is going. I think it seems like council is more clear than on the other piece, but I would still like to get the county's perspective on that because we had a meeting with a couple of county commissioners and the planning director, and they definitely wanted to dive a little deeper into this. But I would like to point out a lot of the data that has been coming forward over the past couple days and weeks about corporate landlords, and we know that they are buying up single-family zoned properties, and they will continue to do that. We, in fact, learned today, a couple council members, that the professional organization is actually setting up their first office in the country here in Charlotte because of how much business they want to do in this market. I think it would be, I would imagine they have a lot to say about this from their business model perspective. So I think I am not comfortable with giving them a couple of years to fit their heritage, to take away from our canopy because it fits into their shareholders' interests. That doesn't fit our interests. That's a real concern. I think it's material. I think it's been backed up with fact. So I'm really not comfortable. I think this is a big blow while we are doing more. I think it largely leaves the biggest facilitator of loss of our tree canopy intact, and in fact, it gives a runway to landlords that are well positioned to take full advantage of this window of time. So I hope we come back stronger because this is not making me feel comfortable. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We'll now go to the next item, which is the proposed UDO zoning districts.
Yes, so if you could advance the slides to the header that says parking.
Excuse me, my hand is up.
Yeah, are we not allowed to comment again?
So I'm sorry, and I just saw her hand. Ms. Watlington's hand is up.
You are allowed, but I just have to know it, and I will recognize as I see it. So, Ms. Watlington?
Thank you.
Mr. Bakari, are you requesting to speak again?
Yes, please.
All right, if you, Ms. Watlington? Is there
Sure.
anyone else that would like to speak again on this issue? All right, Ms. Watlington, followed by Mr. Bakari.
So just a couple of things. In you all's inbox, you should each have a copy of Still Creek Resident Association's letter pertaining to some of the most impactful articles in the UDO. I would encourage you to please look over it and read it, ask questions. One of the items that they did mention was the tree canopy and the impact of fees and permitting on those of us who are not corporate landlords or out-of-state owners, but those of us who are residents of the city and who are property owners and want to stay here and be able to do that in such a way that is affordable, wanted to lift up. And I appreciate some of the comments before regarding how we're doing this review. It would certainly be helpful to have some of the things that the mayor mentioned, as well as a specific article section reference to be able to go to, because as you're jumping through the UDO, having to flip back and forth to Article 40 to figure out what fees apply to which articles, it could be a little more clear. But that being said, I would like to lift up that for those folks who may be impacted by this and may live in vulnerable areas that, like you mentioned, Revolution Park, that has a large percentage of heritage trees. You also have residents there who've been there a long time who may have dead trees that need to be cut down, things of that nature, who will be severely impacted by these increased fees and needs for permits. So if we can make sure that we're considering the individual homeowners that live in this city as we put this together, that would be fantastic. The other piece that I wanted to lift up is I can appreciate certainly the need for environmental justice, the need for sustainability and preserving our tree canopy, all of those things have real tangible value. And I think it's okay to quantify that and lay that up against the financial component and how that impacts the rest of our goals. It is not an either or, it has to be both, because that's the decision, is how do we balance and prioritize the qualitative impacts. That said, I think that it's very important that as we are making these decisions, and even as we think about the timeline for this UDO decision, it seems like there's a whole lot of questions and I don't want to say very little, but not enough data analysis to be able to actually analyze a decision. So I would just caution us again that we not lean forward into something where we know we don't have the information to make an educated and informed decision. It's okay to go do due diligence and understand the impacts, because that's really what we should be deciding about, not a general or broad philosophy. That's all.
Thank you, Ms. Watlington. Mr. Bakari?
Yeah, I mean, that was exactly perfectly said. And just to add on to that, it's one thing to cherish our tree canopy and recognize how important it is for us to protect it, and how important it is for us to recognize that it's a lot, it contributes a lot to our success, to the wins we have, to the growth we've experienced. It is quite another thing to say, we love it so much, we're just going to blindly jump in and say, oh, we don't need to look at that, we have to do this. Like, everything has a cost. And we can all agree on the fact that tree canopy is important, while also saying quantify everything and show us the data, because ultimately we're going to have to make some decisions. We may very well make the decision that the canopy is worth this, but we have to understand how that impacts ultimately the affordability of the housing down the chain, because this is how we get into a spot where we can't be eyes closed on this side saying trees are important and eyes closed over here saying affordability is important. This is exactly why our ordinance Frankenstein spaghetti bowl of a mess has existed the way it has so far. People didn't have the political will to say sidewalks in this scenario trump trees, or vice versa. And that's what we're supposed to be doing right now. So I understand what Councilman Winston is saying, and I agree on the side that we need to cherish the trees, but not blindly. Like, we really need to make sure we do the analysis so that when we make the decision, we know what that did to affordability and we accept that. We don't try to pretend it didn't happen. And then the final point is, I think we need to be real careful where we're headed right now, because there's a fine line between incentivizing the outcomes we want and being creative and innovative and putting the work in and figuring out how to achieve a great tree canopy outcome. It's another thing to use regulation and, in doing so, penalize things and take away rights, particularly in a country that's largely founded around property rights. This is an incredibly slippery slope where we may end up going down a path where we cause more harm than good based on an approach we take. So I'd really encourage us to look at how can we incentivize activity versus how can we just completely take what is ultimately, in a lot of cases, a lazier approach of completely shutting things out and saying they can't happen.
Mr. Eggleston, did I just see you raise your hand? Okay, go ahead, and then Mr. Newton. And I just want to, I know you all don't like it when I do this, but we do have 4 topics total. We're getting into our second hour. So just to keep in mind, because I think everybody should express their views, but then when we go around again, I think it's really important to do that with staff so they understand where you're coming from. And then we're going to all really have to talk to each other to say, you know, what's a make or break? What's a deal breaker? And we'll reach out to all you guys to collect that information to see where we are. But I just want to keep that in mind, because the other 3 topics that we have are also have bubbled up as the most critical topics. So Mr. Eggleston, go ahead.
I just wanted to reiterate, because I think that if folks are watching, there could be confusion. But if Mr. Porter can restate the details of this better than I can, I'm sure, so I'll ask him to do that. But for our homeowners in areas that have a lot of heritage trees who might be dealing with a dead or diseased tree that needs to come down, we have created a provision in this in any scenario we move forward where there is not a fee or a fine or a permit or whatever, right, Mr. Porter?
That's correct, yes.
Right. So I just I don't think that was the intent of what was said, but I think it could have been misunderstood by some who might have thought that we have not allowed for that. We certainly have, and we want to make sure that there are trees that do have to come down for a variety of very legitimate reasons, and we don't want to add extra burden to a homeowner who's already incurring some cost for those situations. So I just want to make sure that that's clear.
Thank you, Councilmember Eggleston. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Mr. Newton, you still have another comment? Can we get just a quick one?
Quick question. It is really building upon Councilmember Eggleston's question or point he just made. I missed that slide about the exceptions for non-land development customers that we're providing to be exempt from the permitting requirement or some of the kind of the harsher realities of that requirement. Is one of those exceptions, is it safety as well? So certainly diseased and dead trees, but what if a tree that is otherwise healthy, if it's presenting itself as a safety concern or hazard, say growing up against someone's home in an unsafe manner, root structures may be presenting safety concerns or issues, is that part of would that constitute one of those exceptions to that permitting requirement for non-land development customers?
I think it could, it may be a little bit case by case in that scenario, but we are recommending the allowance of trees that are not dead, diseased, dying, or obviously hazardous, but per an assessment by a certified arborist, could be expected to fail or cause significant damage to a structure in 1 to 3 years from time of assessment. So a tree may fall into that category and also qualify as not needing a permit for removal.
Okay, I think it's worth fleshing out that criteria as well to maybe make it an additional exception for safety concerns. That's all I've got. Thank you, Madam Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mr. Newton. Okay, we'll go ahead. Allison, if you want to go on to the proposed UDO zoning districts.
I guess, so if you could advance to the parking, yep, right there. That's perfect. Thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Laura Harmon.
Thank you, Allison. Parking is another topic that we heard quite a bit about. We received a lot of comments, and we actually had a virtual session on parking, and wanted to tell you all, based on the feedback that we heard, what we are bringing to you as an alternative to what is currently in the draft UDO. And first, before getting into the details, what we typically heard, and we even heard some of this from council, is that our minimum parking requirements are too high, that we should look at reducing those, eliminating those. There was reference to what Raleigh has recently done as far as eliminating their minimums. And we have an alternative proposal as a starting point for discussion with you all on what we might do with parking. And before I get into the specifics of what we're recommending, want to reference the zoning districts that we have, because the parking requirements are based on 3 tiers, and we are proposing to maintain those tiers at least until we have further discussion, and they are based on the zoning districts. So our neighborhood zoning districts, as a reminder, we have our neighborhood 1, A through F. Those relate to the neighborhood 1 place type. We have our neighborhood 2, A through C. We have 2 commercial districts, general commercial and regional commercial. Right now we have 3 campus districts. We're looking at adding a 4th, and 2 manufacturing and logistics districts, and then an innovation mixed-use district, IMU. We then have center zoning districts with our neighborhood center NC, 2 community activity center districts, a regional activity center district, urban center, urban edge, and 4 transit-oriented development districts, or TOD districts, and then we also have a manufactured home park. Just going through those to remind you of the districts, and you're also going to see them on the next slides. So,
Excuse me, I'm sorry. I'm trying to follow along in the UDO. What are we in a particular article, or is this sprinkled in throughout all of these zoning district articles as it relates to parking?
We're moving into now the parking standards. These are just the zoning districts in the UDO that are referenced in multiple articles.
Right, where are the parking standards that you're about to discuss? Is that just Article 19, or is it sprinkled throughout?
I believe it is in Article 19. I don't have the exact article number, I apologize.
Thank you.
But it is in a single article, the parking standards are. So next slide. So this is the three-tiered approach, where we have the tier 1, where we have minimum off-street parking requirements with no maximum. These are the most auto or vehicularly intensive districts, the most dependent, we think, on having parking. We have the tier 2, where we have both minimum and maximum off-street parking requirements. And it's really kind of the middle ground. They're starting to urbanize. They're a little bit more urban than tier 1, but not as urban as what we have in tier 3. And so in tier 3 is where we have no parking minimums, except for a limited number of uses in certain locations, particularly when they're close to neighborhood 1. And then we have maximum parking in these areas. And these include our TOD districts, and this is the approach in the TOD districts that you all approved a couple of years ago. We have our most urban districts, the urban center, which would be our new UMUD, Regional Activity Center, Urban Edge, and the more intense Community Activity Center district. So this is the approach that we have now. Our first recommendation, in the interest of beginning to minimize off-street parking requirements, is to move the neighborhood 2B, which is the middle district of our neighborhood 2 zoning districts, from tier 1 to tier 2. So it would move to a tier that had a lower minimum and also a maximum off-street parking requirements. So starting to move towards lesser parking requirements by moving that district. And then we'd like to go to the next slide and start to show you some of the changes that we are recommending as far as what the standards could be adjusted to. So again, tier 1, which is used for manufacturing and logistics, our more suburban campus districts, manufactured home park, our neighborhood 1 districts, and our least intense neighborhood 2 district, N2A, would fall under tier 1. They'd have minimum parking requirements, no maximum. But we are suggesting, as an alternative for you all to consider, reducing the single-family requirement from 2 spaces per unit to 1 space per unit, and reducing for other residential in these districts to go from 1.5 spaces per unit to 1 space per unit. For non-residential, our recommendation is to go from 1 space per 500 square feet to 1 space per 750. So again, that would reduce the minimum parking requirement. We do want to note that some uses do have different parking standards based on their unique characteristics, like car wash and correctional facilities, but we would look at reducing the minimum parking requirement under this proposal for those as well. If we go to the next slide, this is tier 2 is our minimum, our middle tier, and this applies to innovation mixed use, the more intense campus district, the neighborhood center district. We're recommending, again, moving that N2B district into this tier, also N2C, which is the most intense neighborhood 2 district, our commercial districts, and the least intense community activity center district. This includes the proposal, we have minimums and maximums. We think that typically people will not overpark,
But we do think that maximums are important in some cases, just to manage the amount of parking and make sure that we're getting something that is consistent with the context in which they're located. So here we're recommending reducing the minimum from 1 space per dwelling unit to 0.8 spaces per dwelling unit, reducing for non-residential from 1 space per 750 square feet to 1 space per 1,000 square feet, maintaining the maximums that we have now. And again, we have some uses with unique standards based on their characteristics. And the Tier 3, we're not recommending changes at this point in time. Again, this is based on the adopted TOD districts. We think it's been working well. We haven't heard feedback that it isn't. It is focused on maximum off-street parking requirements. And I won't read to you the minimum and the maximums. We are a bit short on time, but to let you know that other than the minor changes that we have already proposed in the draft UDO, we're not recommending additional changes for you all to consider. And our next slide, I believe, is for discussion.
Thank you, Laura. I don't see hands up yet. Feel free to throw your hands up there. And in the meantime,
I have my hand up.
Mine up too.
Okay, Donata's getting to it. So while she puts that up, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead before I get that from Donata. Donata, in Tier 3, or excuse me, not Donata, Laura, in Tier 3, residential uses may be eliminated with a local city parking permit program. I'd like to know how serious we are about that, because my concern for that is where TOD butts up to single-family neighborhoods. And that, again, for me, this is all about transition. And we are already seeing impact on this. We had this discussion when we looked at rezoning the hotel site on Cleveland, because there's 3 restaurants there that don't offer any parking, and we're about to get 2 buildings there, one of which doesn't want to offer any parking, and they don't have to by right. That's all going to flow into the neighborhoods. It has to. So I just need to know a little bit more about a parking permit program. Elizabeth's asked about that. The Elizabeth neighborhood, 4th Ward has it. I believe they're the only ones that have it. But we have to be serious about allowing neighborhoods to have a parking permit program.
If I could jump in, Laura. I mean, I think what we're saying is that when you have those uses like restaurants and things like that next to those neighborhood areas, they would have to provide parking. Like, parking is required in those situations. If they want to apply to not have parking, they would have to demonstrate a strategy or have a parking permit program. I know we have a limited number of parking permit areas in the city, and it's something that we're talking to CDOT about. Could that be expanded? But in absence of that, then the parking would be required.
But TOD doesn't require it, and you're saying TOD is in Tier 3.
So TOD does when you have a restaurant or certain bars, nightclubs, when they're close to N1, they do have a requirement.
Okay, I'll talk with you offline, because I can tell you exactly which ones don't right now, and they're parking in the neighborhoods.
In the draft UDO, they would.
They would.
So current
Oh, so
regulations, they don't.
retroactive.
Wouldn't be retroactive, but going forward with the new regulations, we have made adjustments.
So they would be grandfathered in to not have to have parking.
We couldn't require them to have parking if it's already
At this
been built
point.
and permitted, but all future projects would have that requirement.
Okay, that's good to know, and that's for TOD. Okay. Let's see, Ms. Ejmira.
Thank you, Madam Mayor Pro Tem. Can you go back to the last slide? So we are not moving away from no parking minimums, is that correct?
We are
Did you hear-
looking at where we have parking minimums, retaining them, but having them be lower. On the last slide, the Tier 3, in most cases, we would have no minimum. There are a few exceptions, as Mayor Pro Tem was mentioning, but in most cases, we would have no minimum.
Yeah, so I need to better understand when we have no minimum, and in cases where we will have minimum. I know Raleigh passed no parking minimum. So I'm trying to understand that applied to everything. How is it different from what Raleigh just did?
Raleigh eliminated minimums for all development.
So that includes even residential?
Everything, as we understand it, all development, yes. And we're bringing you a proposal that moves in the direction of Raleigh. Certainly interested in hearing your feedback if you're interested in, as a council, in removing all minimums.
Yeah, so I mean, even if we don't have parking minimum, we will still have, we are just letting the market decide what the parking should be rather than the regulations decide. And that's what Raleigh did. So I think we got to at least explore that, because I know many folks are concerned about the cost of housing. Sorry, just a second. Sharon. So I think we got to explore no parking minimum, similar to what City of Raleigh did, and letting the market decide what it should be. And that might lead to some of the cost savings that developers have raised some concerns around how this could contribute to higher cost. That's all I have.
Thank you, Ms. Sedgmira. Mr. Winston?
Thank you. What is, to kind of what Ms. Sedgmira's line of questioning, what is the methodology that we got to the number for the minimums? Basically, how did we get to 1 or 0.8? Why wasn't it 0?
Again, this is a little bit more art than science. We've looked at what a lot of the standards are across the country, working with our consultant, Camiris, and I believe we have at least Aristus Strungis online. We were looking at reducing from our original proposal. We are open to however council would like to guide us, if you'd like us to reduce it more. We're hearing a range of perspectives as we talk to different folks, so we can certainly reduce it more. There's no right way to do this. Every community does it differently, and we can provide you additional data if that would be helpful. We just need to know what would be helpful for you all as a council to make a decision.
Yeah, well, I'll definitely be clear. I thought I've asked for this before, and I thought other people have asked for this before. I would like to see an option with no parking minimums. I also don't mind seeing one without parking maximums. As Ms. Sedgmira said, I think the market should decide where personal vehicle parking is needed. When we talk about affordable housing, if you really want to, as we spent a lot of time around heritage trees a few minutes ago, parking is the number one cost, that you can look at. Parking deck structures, you're looking at at least $25,000 per parking space. That's a material quantitative analysis right there. So if we want to reduce the ability and increase the types of housing, then we need to have the ability for by right for housing and development to occur without mandated expensive parking to it. So please provide one of those options moving forward. That'd be really helpful.
Thank you. Mr. Driggs?
Thank you. I have a slightly different perspective on this, which is that developers will seek to avoid the cost of parking. It's only rational, and their calculation will be at what point, if they cut back on the number of parking spaces, will the inconvenience that they create by not having enough parking spaces affect their own tenants. They're not going to be sensitive to the external implications of cars parking on the street or on somebody else's parking lot nearby. So I think that we need to look at the number of cars that need to find a place to park or are expected to park at a given location and make sure that that they do incur the cost of accommodating those cars, because otherwise the impact on their surroundings of having people show up in cars and not being able to park is a negative. I think it's more a question of being quantitative and analytical about what those requirements should be, like how many people in practice at a given location are going to need to arrive in their cars, and they need to be absorbed on site, because the presumption that there is on-street parking or that they could use other parking lots or whatever is a little antisocial. So I think there needs to be, I would just like to see a better justification for what those minimums are. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Driggs. Mr. Eggleston?
Thank you. I am glad that the changes we've shown here are moving us away from a more car-centric approach to a less car-centric approach. So I think we are headed in the right direction. I agree with Mr. Winston that I would also like to consider an option that takes that even further. And I think that Ms. Eisel's point about residential parking permits is related, because you know, I represent several of the neighborhoods who are most impacted by being as close as they are to commercial corridors, particularly eating and drinking establishments and things of the like, that even when there's not parking, that customers have realized that they can park a block or two away in front of, into the kind of core of the residential area of the neighborhood. I do think that parking is an if you build it, they will come sort of proposition. And I think that in areas where folks have time and again driven and found it to be very difficult to park, they've likely, when they've gone back to patronize those businesses, more strongly considered using things like ride sharing apps. And I think that's good from reducing drinking and driving. I think it's good for a lot of reasons. I do believe that if we expand, and I know historically the city has not been real eager to expand our residential parking permit program, but I think where there is a concentrated desire from residents to participate in that program, and I think we could quantify the eligibility of certain neighborhoods in relation to how proximate the residential section of an area of a neighborhood is to the commercial section. But I do think by expanding the eligibility of neighborhoods that are in those kinds of situations, allowing them to have a residential parking permit, there will be a learning curve for citizens, but I think that we can move people more towards where we ultimately want them to be, which is using alternative modes of transportation. So I think those go hand in hand. I think if we go the next step further, as Mr. Winston has proposed, and as I think several of us would like to see, I think that has to be hand in hand with what the Mayor Pro Tem has said, which is expanding residential parking permits. So I would like to see both of those things sort of fleshed out a little further, because we have done better here, but I think we could do better still. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Newton.
I think you might have called on me, Madam Mayor.
I'm sorry, I didn't have my speaker on. Mr. Newton.
Okay, thank you. So I have concerns regarding reducing the parking minimums across the board, more particularly in Tier 1 and Tier 2. I understand that we want to be less auto-centric. At the same time, I just don't feel like it's practical to reduce these minimums across the board. I know that we are modeling ourselves upon Raleigh's initiative. I just want us to recognize the fact that we are twice the square mileage of Raleigh. We're certainly twice the population density, but I think the more compelling point to me is that we have twice the land area. That means that we have plenty of places within our city where there are not alternative modes of transportation available to the residents. It's harder for us to supply and maintain transit corridors and transit options for those reasons. And so I'm not against us eliminating parking minimums in certain areas. I think we need to look at location. I'm not against us doing it in areas that have plenty of transit options and other amenities, but I think it's really important that we recognize that there are other areas that don't, and that it really creates a public safety hazard, so a safety to people's own person, for us to ask that maybe they traverse areas or roads rather than be in a car and subject themselves to no sidewalks, what have you. And also, I think we should be mindful of those areas where there simply is no ability to access transit. As much as we want to move away from being an auto-centric city, I feel like there are areas where there is no choice for residents. And to Councilmember Driggs's point, I think in many of the equations that developers balance when they're building developments, they're looking at unit count for profitability, and us, eliminating or reducing those parking minimums just means higher unit counts, meaning a greater burden upon those areas and upon those eventual residents. Not everybody has the ability to choose where they want to live. And my fear is that we will be placing many people in a very precarious position where they do need to use their cars, but they're not going to have those options. So anyhow, for me, I look at Tier 1 and Tier 2 in particular, and I feel like it's a mistake for us to reduce those parking minimums, and that's something that I would definitely not be in favor of. So that's my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Watlington.
Thank you. A few things. I think we got to be careful, just like we were talking about with the trees. We've got to ascertain what our priorities are based on the values that we're able to assign. So back to that data piece, because better is relative to much of what Councilmember Newton said. Certainly there are places in our community where it makes sense for people who choose to live in certain areas where there is transit available to be able to have parking minimum or eliminate parking minimums. I'm also concerned, like Mayor Pro Tem, living in a neighborhood where we're going to be even more so transitional versus higher density nearby. We understand that right now, we see it today, that people will just park their cars along other residential streets that aren't necessarily even built to support that amount of traffic. So we've got to be practical about that. And I think if we're going to have this conversation about eliminating parking minimums across the board, I don't think that should apply to every area. And I think it has to go hand in hand with what we're going to do to get serious about investing in our transit. Because if we say people need to be able to get there and it's something that's accessible, it's got to be something that our public transit supports, because everybody cannot afford to jump in rideshare. I think that we're talking about people who are traveling for leisure that want to go to certain neighborhoods over the weekend or to have lunch or dinner or whatever. But considering that our housing cost is rising, people that are working at these establishments that aren't getting paid high wages oftentimes have to live even further out. And for them to drive in and not even be able to park to go into their workplace, I think that creates additional inequity. In addition, if we think about leaving it to the market to determine parking minimums, I think about areas like the same neighborhoods we talk about that are vulnerable to displacement, the same neighborhoods we talk about where there's cheaper land, the same neighborhoods where we talk about seeing an increase in non-owner occupant homes. These are the places that will be most susceptible to, I'll say, value engineered development. And you'll end up with just another, I'll say, issue in these neighborhoods where we don't have sufficient parking because people are just throwing up low-cost development, which we know is not going to translate into affordable housing, because it doesn't have to, because there are people in our city moving here every day that can afford to pay more and will pay more. So I think we've got to approach this with more of a targeted lens. I like that the tiers. I like the tier system. I'm not a fan of moving into B to tier 2, just because I don't think that going down to the number. I think it was 1. Can't remember. Can you go to the previous slide? Yeah, I already think that the existing tier 1 areas need more than just one space per dwelling unit, particularly here where you see the single family and the other residential, because again, we're already seeing it on our streets. I think about too, everybody that lives at your house, when you think about a residential parking program, and you think about neighborhoods who may not necessarily be even organized, how does that impact someone that's coming in? Your everyday resident that is not plugged in, where are you going to get these permits? How's that going to be enforced? What strain does that put on our police officers? Is that something that we're going to try to enforce through non-sworn kind of law enforcement? What does that look like? Because essentially that just becomes people policing each other. So I think we got to be a little bit more thoughtful about what the impact actually is on these neighborhoods that are in transition and that are not right near transit. I do have a question, and Councilmember Graham or staff, whoever is able to speak to it. Some time ago, we approved a development for building District 2 without any parking requirements, and I was just curious how that's going.
I think it's still under construction.
Okay.
So we hadn't seen the impact yet, but I'm very concerned. As you know, I voted in the minority in that, but I'm very concerned for the same reasons many have articulated.
Thank you. That's all for me.
Thank you. And Ms. Watlington, just to speak to that, that one has restrictions in their leases about having cars. There's 2 being built in Noda right now, I believe on the same street, and a business owner on that street reached out to me and said, already one of those buildings, 80 residents have moved in, they all have cars.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
And they're parking, and so their business has been impacted because nobody can park there now. All those on the little street, all of those parking spots are gone, where they were counting on that for their business. And on Brevard, people are driving in to park there so they can take the light rail. So they're not paying for parking. So I am concerned that we aren't considering sort of a saturation point when you say you've got this little area and it's a great idea to let's get people to use public transportation, but if everything there is multifamily, 8 stories up that doesn't require parking, it's just not tenable.
Exactly.
So that example is already live and it's up and going. Mr. Bakari?
Yeah, thanks. I really believe this topic right here has the potential, if we get it right, to have the greatest impact on anything that we're going to do through this period. And I say that because just think about the amount of time every month we spend in conversations that touch on one of 2 topics, parking or traffic, right? I mean, and the reason why is we've got a rule set, as we know, that is convoluted. It doesn't really hit the mark. It's a broad brush for unique situations. And then we end up debating transactionally on a case-by-case basis, does this project deserve this? And that's why I think the answer here is actually not in the route that you're taking it. Right now, you're coming up with like a simplified set of rules. And there's this tier and this level. And I think the problem is you can't approach this with rules because that are hard-coded, because it will ultimately be too broad brush, and we'll still end up debating everything transactionally. So when I personally have to get involved in controversial and contentious rezonings in my district, what I use instead of rules is a real simple process. It's 3 principles. Principles are much higher, they're more aspirational in what they're attempting to achieve, and to me, they are is what you're like. 1, you're not responsible for solving the problems of everything that existed there before you. 2, you are responsible for mitigating the impact of new things that you're building there within the reason of by right. And then 3, if it's over and above, if you're asking for over and above what you should be able to do there by our rules, how does that equalize out based on the benefits to the community and other concessions you're doing? So I think we could take a principle approach to this to say, all right, here's how we're going to do it. And the example was just said a minute ago that I think is good. Instead of saying how many exact cars per spot that we have, we say, you're going to mitigate whatever you do. And whatever you do at that point, you're going to also have to enforce it. So if you come in and want one space per unit, then you have to show us that you're going to build that out and that you're going to enforce it every single day for the people that are residents there and all those things, and that we're not going to have to worry about it. And if you want 5 spaces, great, you're there and you do the same thing. So that way, we're not in the business of like trying to make transactional decisions. We say, you've mitigated what net new impacts you've created in this environment in number of cars. And if you want below a certain amount that's minimums or above a certain amount that's maximums, it's fine. You're the one that's got to make sure you handle that. And that will get us out of that business entirely.
Thank you. Mr. Phipps.
Yeah, I can hear what Mr. Picari is saying, and to a certain extent, also what Ms. Watlington was saying too. I'm curious as to those areas where you want to consider expanded residential parking permits. I mean, the practicality of that is who would we be depending on to enforce that, and how would we seek enforcement of that? Does anybody know?
The same way every other city does.
So I don't know. I mean, do we know how other cities have been doing their success rate in enforcing those parking permits? I mean, I'm trying to figure it out.
I mean, I think that's probably a discussion that we could have offline, but I mean, I think there's different ways in which cities manage their parking permits, and that's generally done through our Department of Transportation, and we can have a discussion with CDOT and planning on that topic.
Talking like Pocket or something, they rolling around in little golf carts or something, handing out tickets or something, or something to that effect?
That's what you would do.
I think that's part of the challenge of a parking permit program is the enforcement aspect of it.
Right. I think it might be easier said than done, and I don't know how. I also have concerns about limiting parking minimums, because I think we're going to be asking for more problems and more complaints by residents complaining about the lack of parking even for their own residences. So, but I mean, it's good debate, good discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It looks like that's the last question. Yeah, let's go ahead to the next topic.
Laura, do you want me to, can I tee this up really quick? Sure. So when we were working on the policy map, there were a lot of questions about adjacencies, and particularly as it relates to centers and other place types adjacent to our neighborhood 1 areas. And so in the first draft of the UDO, we recognized that that's probably something that that was outside of the policy map process and something that needed to be in the regulations. And so we had a draft in the first draft of what that transition from our neighborhood areas could look like. And we want to remind you of that and then talk through some other alternatives that we've been considering. So Laura will walk through those.
Yes, thank you. This is what is in the current draft of the UDO, and we're really looking again at properties that are abutting the neighborhood 1 place type, so that's where you're next to your less intense residential, having a standard that would limit your height to 65 feet for the first 200 feet from the lot line of a property that is in a neighborhood 1 place type. And then after that, going to the maximum zoning district height for that property. And this is what is in the TOD by and large, and so we borrowed from that. So we've heard again, as Allison said, some feedback on that and have a couple of alternatives to show you all to see how you feel about those alternatives and whether you think there are improvements over what is in the draft. So next slide. So this is the first alternative, and that would be to limit to 50 feet in height for the first 100 feet, and then the next 100 feet would be 65 feet in height, same as what's in the draft UDO for that area, and then you would go to your maximum zoning district height. And we're going to show you in a minute something that compares all three of these. So that is the first alternative we have. The second alternative is a little bit different, and that is to limit your height to 40 feet for the first 75 feet. And then after that, include a height plane, what we call a height plane, where you would increase your height 1 feet for every 2 feet that you horizontally moved away from the neighborhood one place type, and that would occur until you got to 200 feet from that neighborhood one place type, and then you would go to your maximum zoning district height. So if we go to the next slide, what you can see are the three alternatives. One is what is currently in the draft. The second one is alternative A, and the third one is alternative B. Just to compare alternative B, you have lesser height when you're closer to the neighborhood one place type, but as you move further away, you can see that area in pink where you would have greater height than you did with alternative A and what we currently have in the draft. Alternative A, you can see, compared to the draft, just reduces your height for that first 100 feet, and then you are in what is in the draft. So this is the comparison we have, and I think if we keep it on this slide, it would probably be easiest for discussion. We'd be glad to go back and answer any questions you have on the others.
Yeah, definitely, this is the right slide. But Laura, where does it start? So the current ordinance says 20 feet off the lot line. You can go to 40 feet. So is 20 feet still in there?
Yeah, technically, the measurement starts at the lot line, but you are required to have a landscape yard, and you would really not be able to put your building any closer than the landscape yard.
Which is how many feet?
It depends. It's either 10 or 25, or there's an even greater one for districts like the manufacturing and logistics districts.
So all draft one, alternative A and B takes out the 20-foot requirement that's in the current ordinance?
It does, but if we put the current ordinance on top of this, the heights are actually greater than what is allowed by the alternatives we have here. So this is a moderation, and we'd be glad to share that. We didn't want to put more lines on here because it gets really confusing, but it is a greater, it would be greater heights than the proposals we have here.
And I appreciate that. I would like to see a minimum off the lot line, because
Sure.
those trees can die, and who knows, but, you know, it seems to me you still have to have a minimum off of the lot line, because like the picture of that house there looks like it's a lot further away than 20 feet off their lot line, but if it were actually whatever the setback is, allowance to their lot line, you know, you still could get pretty darn close to a tall building, and I think that's the key. I do appreciate the transition. Mr. Winston.
Yes, thank you. So looking at these, the draft and the alternatives, is there a difference in the developable amount of height? Or are these all kind of equal out to each other?
So there would be some difference in that. Alternative A is certainly less than you could build under the current draft, because you see that light blue area, that area you could not build in compared to the current draft. So, and we can go back and do the actual calculations on this. We'd have to make some assumptions that you're going to have a building that's big enough to go to 200 feet. But we could go back and give you the specifics on what that would be. You can see alternative B would be less than the draft. In the area where you have the light green and the light blue, that would be what would be less. And then you would get more than what's in the draft in that pink area. So alternative B would be probably somewhat less, but that's also assuming that you're building that close to the neighborhood one place type lot line. In a lot of cases, you're going to have parking and structured parking and things like that that are going to be under that height, and the height really does occur further away. So we could show you kind of if you used all of your site, what would the difference be? But certainly if you had buildings that were further away from the lot line, what you might lose or gain would vary depending on the alternatives.
Yeah. Also, is there any type of consideration as to, I know we're comparing, for instance, on the backside, how it abuts residential neighborhood place types, but how about how they interact with, I guess, transit or transportation corridors? I guess so I think we want our most intense development on our busier streets and less our neighborhood streets, for instance. But we have neighborhoods throughout the city, whether you think about the Central Avenue corridor, Graham Street, South Boulevard, where we have either made transit investments and transportation investments, or we have, for instance, Central Ave, I think, has the highest frequency and ridden bus route. So we want the development intensity to be on those streets. So if we limit that intensity because of the height, don't we potentially over time threaten encroaching into the neighborhoods with more intense development, because they wouldn't be able to go up? They would have to continue to go wide. Have we considered anything like that, or those types of effects on neighborhoods?
So what we have done here, and where we really do take that into account, is your maximum height in that district. And we're continuing to look at those to see if we should make some adjustments. Your maximum height, if you're near transit, like a light rail line, is very high compared to what you could do in the area closest to neighborhood one. So what we're really trying to do is say, let's protect the area that is close to neighborhood one, and let's let the heights go high when you're a little bit further away to minimize the impact on those neighborhoods. I think we have enough land in our community and what we will be zoning through the UDO that it would not push into the neighborhood one neighborhoods. And if it did, it would require rezoning and a lot of consideration by the residents and the council in making those decisions.
Yeah, I think this is on a good path. Again, I think, my concern, and, the Ascent rezoning is a perfect example of this. What are our values how do we balance our values in terms of neighborhood place types versus the types of development that we want to see on transit or transportation intensive corridors. I don't know how we kind of define that or quantify that, but I think it's important in dealing with this piece.
Thank you. Ms. Ajmera.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Can we get an example of what the current requirement is and what is the proposed? I would like to see it in pictures, just to really get an understanding of how would this, we often hear from residents where higher structure towering over their single-family resident. So I just want to get a better idea of how this will look under proposed compared to what is currently.
We can provide that, yes.
Okay, thank you.
And I sent you all a picture of an existing one that is 20 feet from the lot line. They can go up starting at 40 feet.
So yeah, Julie, it would be great to have side-by-side current versus proposed so that council get to see if this proposed change was to be adopted, this is what it will look like, or it might look like. Thank you.
I don't have the art skills, but maybe you all can.
No, that was for staff, not for you, Julie.
Phew. Any other questions? Okay, no other questions. You sure? Okay. That's it. If we are done with the height transition, Allison thinks we're okay to close out with that. And we do have the opportunities to bring these things up still in transportation planning. We have 2 meetings this month, so we really do want to get through this. And I'm going to reach out to everybody too, just to see really I've been trying to take notes on what everybody's highest priorities are so that we can really try to get through it and see, where we can come to an agreement on. So to get this done with this council. Okay, if nobody else has any other questions, then we'll go ahead and wrap up.
I do have a question. I'm sorry, it's not specific to this, and forgive me if I missed it. It's a process question. This is the first of several workshops. Is that the case?
If this is the first of several workshops?
I mean, we appreciate the time that you all are providing to comment on these topics as we work through what the draft and ultimately the document will look like. So certainly appreciate having these workshops. If you find it valuable, we do as well.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I agree. That's a great question. I think they're valuable because it also helps. I think we all have different things that are really on our minds, especially depending on the district you're in. So it's really important to bring these things to light and hear from each other what's most important. So I'd be in favor of that.
Same.
Okay, with that, do I need a motion to adjourn?
Pro Tem, it's Ed. Are we not talking about zoning translation and alignment at this meeting?
Just on the interest of time, we thought we'd bring that to TAP on the next TAP meeting, just since we've held you past your time.
Nothing but time.
I appreciate that. I'm all in favor of that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everybody. I guess we don't need a motion, so y'all just go on with your night. Thank you.